Evelyn Cartwright stepped off the private jet with a sense of excitement bubbling inside her. The crisp London air greeted her as she adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and glanced at the sprawling cityscape ahead. This was her first trip to England, and she wasn't about to let anything dull the experience. Known for her larger-than-life personality and overflowing bank account, Evelyn had built a reputation back home as someone who lived life on her own terms. She thrived on attention, whether it came from her millions of social media followers or the gossip columns that loved to track her every move. Her days were filled with luxury, five-star hotels, exclusive parties, and shopping sprees in the most expensive boutiques. But this time, Evelyn wanted something different. She craved an adventure, a story so unique that it would make headlines and keep her name trending for weeks. That's why she had booked a personalized tour of London's iconic landmarks, including Buckingham Palace, one of the most famous royal residences in the world. As her chauffeur-driven car pulled up near the palace gates, Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. The grandeur of the building took her breath away, but what caught her attention even more were the guards stationed outside. Clad in their striking red tunics and towering bearskin hats, they stood like statues, unmoving and unflinching. Their discipline fascinated her. How do they even stand there for hours without blinking? She wondered aloud, half-jokingly. Her personal guide, a polite young man named Thomas, began explaining the history of the palace and the role of the royal guards. He emphasized how important it was to respect their duties and avoid disrupting them. "These guards are part of a long tradition," he said earnestly. "They represent honor and loyalty." Evelyn nodded absent-mindedly, pretending to listen while scrolling through her phone. To her, these warnings felt unnecessary. After all, hadn't she always managed to charm her way out of tricky situations? Money could fix almost anything, right? The group moved closer to where the guards stood, and Evelyn couldn't help but feel drawn to them. Tourists gathered around, snapping pictures and marveling at the precision of their movements, or lack thereof. Some people tried to get reactions out of the guards by waving or making silly faces, but the soldiers remained completely still. Evelyn smirked, finding their stoicism amusing yet frustrating. What's the point if they don't even react? She muttered under her breath. Her mind started racing with ideas. If everyone else was content with taking boring photos, why not do something bold? Something no one else would dare try. An idea sparked in her head, and before she could second-guess herself, she reached into her designer handbag. There, tucked between her makeup and phone charger, was a small bottle of bright blue paint, a leftover prop from an artsy photo shoot she'd done earlier that week. It was perfect, or so she thought. With a sly grin spreading across her face, Evelyn tightened her grip on the bottle. Her friends noticed the glint in her eye and exchanged nervous glances. They knew Evelyn well enough to recognize when she was about to do something outrageous. "Evie, maybe you shouldn't." One of them started, but Evelyn waved them off with a laugh. "Relax," she said confidently. "It'll be fine." Little did she know, this moment would change everything. For better or worse. Evelyn's eyes sparkled with mischief as she tightened her grip on the small bottle of blue paint. The royal guard standing just a few feet away seemed almost too perfect. His polished boots, his immaculate red uniform, and that expressionless face. To Evelyn, he looked less like a human being and more like a life-size doll placed there for tourists to admire. But dolls weren't supposed to be fun unless they moved or reacted, right? And this one wasn't budging, no matter what anyone did. She glanced around at the other tourists, snapping photos, some laughing nervously as they tried to get the guard to crack a smile. A child waved enthusiastically, but the guard didn't even blink. Another tourist pretended to punch him playfully, only to step back when met with complete silence. Evelyn rolled her eyes. "So boring," she muttered under her breath. Her friends hovered nearby, watching her curiously. They knew Evelyn well enough to sense trouble brewing, but they also knew better than to intervene when she got an idea in her head. "Come on, Evie, One of them said cautiously, "Don't do anything crazy." "Oh, relax," Evelyn replied, waving them off with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "It's just a little fun. No harm done." She flashed a confident grin, though deep down, she wasn't entirely sure herself. Still, the thrill of doing something unexpected, and maybe even shocking, was irresistible. Taking a step closer to the guard, Evelyn tilted her head, studying him like an artist sizing up a blank canvas. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, and his gaze fixed straight ahead. It was almost eerie how still he was, as if he weren't real at all. The thought made her chuckle softly. What would it take to make him react? Would he flinch if she poked him? Laugh if she told a joke? Or maybe, just maybe, he'd finally break character if she did something truly outrageous. Her fingers drummed against the cold plastic of the paint bottle. Blue paint. Bright, bold, impossible to ignore blue paint. The same color she'd used earlier that week during a photo shoot in Paris, where she'd posed with splashes of color across her designer clothes. That shoot had been a hit online, earning thousands of likes and comments praising her creativity. Maybe this could work here too. Maybe pouring paint on the guard's boots wouldn't just be funny, it could be iconic. Evelyn's heart raced as she imagined the reactions. Her followers would eat it up. "Evie strikes again," they'd say, always keeping things interesting. She could already picture the captions. "Even the Queen's Guard can't resist my art," or "When tradition meets modern flair." The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this was a genius move. Who cared about rules or respect? Rules were meant to be broken, and respect was overrated anyway. Or so she told herself. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances as Evelyn crouched slightly, positioning herself near the guard's feet. One of them whispered urgently, "Evie, seriously, stop. This isn't cool." But Evelyn ignored them, her focus laser-sharp. With a quick glance around to ensure no one was paying too much attention, she tipped the bottle ever so slightly. A single drop of blue paint landed on the tip of the guard's shiny black boot. Then another, and another. Before long, the once pristine leather was streaked with bright blue splotches. The crowd gasped audibly. Some people laughed nervously, unsure whether to cheer or scold her. Others shook their heads disapprovingly, muttering under their breath. Evelyn stood up, rushing her hands together, as if she'd just completed a masterpiece. "There," she said triumphantly, flashing her signature smirk. "Now that's memorable." But as she looked up at the guard's face, something shifted. His expression hadn't changed. He remained as stoic as ever. But there was something unsettling about his unwavering composure. For the first time since arriving in London, Evelyn felt a pang of unease. Had she gone too far? For a fleeting moment, Evelyn basked in the chaos she had created. The crowd's gasps and murmurs swirled around her like a storm, and for once, all eyes were on her, not because of her wealth or designer outfits, but because of what she had just done. She felt a strange mix of pride and exhilaration, as if she pulled off some daring stunt that would go down in history. "Iconic," she whispered to herself, grinning ear to ear. Her friends, however, weren't sharing her enthusiasm. They stood frozen, their faces pale with shock, clearly unsure whether to laugh, scold her, or run for cover. But as the seconds ticked by, the initial rush began to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence. The guard hadn't moved. Not even a twitch. His polished boots, now streaked with bright blue paint, seemed almost mocking under the sunlight, highlighting the absurdity of what she'd done. Evelyn squinted up at his face, searching for any sign of emotion. A flicker of annoyance, a hint of amusement, anything. But there was nothing. Just that same stoic expression, staring straight ahead as though she didn't exist. It was unnerving. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how quiet the area had become. The playful chatter of tourists had died down, replaced by awkward glances and hushed whispers. Parents ushered their children away, shooting disapproving looks in her direction. Even her own friends took a step back, creating a small gap between themselves and her. Evelyn swallowed hard, realizing that the attention she craved wasn't the kind she was getting. Instead of admiration, she saw judgment. Instead of laughter, she heard murmurs of disapproval. And then it hit her, the weight of what she'd done. This wasn't just some random prop or mannequin. This was a real person, standing there in service to something much bigger than herself. A royal guard, a symbol of tradition, discipline, and respect. What had started as a silly prank now felt wrong, really wrong. Her stomach churned as doubts crept in. Was this really worth it? Sure, she loved being the center of attention, but not like this. Not when every pair of eyes glaring at her carried a mix of anger and disappointment. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. Her carefully crafted confidence wavered, and she instinctively glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone to step in and save her from the mess she'd made. That's when she noticed the change in the atmosphere. The murmurs grew louder, more urgent. People were pointing behind her, and Evelyn turned slowly, dread pooling in her chest. Approaching them was a tall figure in a crisp uniform, flanked by two other guards. Their expressions were stern, authoritative, and unmistakably serious. This wasn't just a passing reprimand, it was official business. Evelyn's heart sank. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Her mind raced, trying to think of an excuse or a way to smooth things over. Maybe she could laugh it off, or offer to pay for the damaged boots. Surely, money could fix this, right? But as the officer drew closer, his commanding presence left no room for negotiation. He stopped a few feet away, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. The question hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and impossible to ignore. Evelyn's throat went dry. She stammered, struggling to find the right words. I didn't mean," she started, but her voice trailed off. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? The officer gestured toward the splattered boots, his tone leaving no room for excuses. "You've committed an act of vandalism against a member of the Queen's Guard. Do you have any idea what that means?" Evelyn's cheeks burned with shame. She wanted to shrink into the ground, to disappear completely. All those moments of bravado, all the jokes about making memories, they now seemed hollow and reckless. She glanced at the guard again, still standing motionless despite the humiliation she had inflicted. For the first time, she saw him not as a prop or a backdrop, but as a human being doing his duty, and she hated herself for forgetting that. As the officer continued speaking, Evelyn realized the gravity of her actions. This wasn't just about a pair of boots or a social media post gone wrong. It was about respect, or the lack thereof. And as the weight of her mistake settled over her, one thing became painfully clear. She couldn't undo what she had done. All she could do now was face the consequences. The officer's words hit Evelyn like a punch to the gut. Vandalism. The term sounded harsh, almost foreign, as if it belonged to someone else's life, not hers. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. Just moments ago, she had been basking in the thrill of her impulsive prank, convinced it would earn her likes and laughs. Now, reality came crashing down around her, sharp and unrelenting. The crowd that had once buzzed with amusement now stood eerily silent, their collective gaze fixed on her. Parents whispered to each other while pulling their children closer, as if shielding them from her recklessness. Tourists who had previously snapped photos of the guards now turned their cameras toward her, capturing her mortified expression instead. Evelyn felt like a caged animal, under the glare of dozens of judgmental eyes. Her cheeks burned red, and for the first time in her life, she wished she could simply vanish. "Well," the officer prompted, his voice cutting through her panicked thoughts. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, or at least an excuse. that might soften the situation. I didn't mean any harm," she finally stammered, her voice trembling. "It was just a joke." "A joke," the officer repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. He gestured toward the guard whose boots were still smeared with paint. "This isn't a game. These men are here to serve and protect. They represent something far greater than themselves. What you've done is not only disrespectful, but also illegal." Illegal. The word echoed in Evelyn's head, sending a fresh wave of panic coursing through her body. Illegal? How could pouring paint on someone's boots be considered a crime? Back home, people got away with worse all the time. Reckless behavior, public disturbances, even vandalism. Surely this wasn't serious enough to warrant legal action. Was it? Her friends hovered nearby, visibly uneasy. One of them leaned in cautiously and whispered, "Maybe we should call your lawyer." Evelyn nodded weakly, clutching at the idea like a lifeline. Yes, a lawyer. Money and connections could fix this, couldn't they? That's how things worked in her world. But before she could act on the thought, the officer interrupted her train of thought. "You can make your calls later," he said firmly. "For now, you're coming with us." Before Evelyn could protest, 2 guards stepped forward, flanking her on either side. Their presence was intimidating, their expressions unreadable. She glanced at her friends, silently pleading for help, but they looked just as stunned as she felt. No one moved to intervene. Instead, they watched helplessly as Evelyn was escorted away, her designer heels clicking awkwardly against the pavement. As they led her toward a nearby security building, Evelyn's mind spiraled. What would happen next? Would she be arrested, fined, thrown into some medieval dungeon? Her imagination ran wild, conjuring up worst-case scenarios that made her chest tighten with anxiety. She tried to focus on finding a way out, but every attempt at reasoning or apologizing seemed futile. The officers weren't interested in excuses. They were focused on procedure. Inside the small room where she was taken, Evelyn sat stiffly on a hard wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly together. The walls were bare, the air cold and sterile. Everything about the space screamed authority, making her feel smaller than ever before. A uniformed woman entered shortly after, introducing herself as Sergeant Harper. Unlike the earlier officer, her tone was calm but firm. "Miss Cartwright," Sergeant Harper began, opening a file folder on the desk in front of her. "You understand that defacing property associated with the Royal Guard is a criminal offense, correct?" Evelyn nodded meekly, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I really didn't think." "That's exactly the problem," Sergeant Harper interjected, cutting her off mid-sentence. "You didn't think. Actions have consequences, especially when they involve disrespecting institutions as significant as ours." Evelyn swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words settle over her. For years, she had lived her life impulsively, rarely considering the impact of her actions beyond her own satisfaction. Now, faced with the fallout of her carelessness, she realized how reckless she had been. Tears spilled down her cheeks as guilt overwhelmed her. She wanted to explain, to apologize again, but the words stuck in her throat. Sergeant Harper studied her for a moment, then sighed. "We'll need to document this incident thoroughly. Depending on the severity, charges may be filed. Until then, consider this a lesson, a reminder that privilege doesn't exempt you from responsibility." Those final words lingered in the air, sinking deep into Evelyn's heart. Responsibility. The hours that followed felt like an eternity for Evelyn. Sitting in the cold, sterile room of the security building, she replayed the events of the day over and over in her mind. Each memory was sharper now, more vivid than before. Her impulsive decision to pour paint on the guard's boots, the shocked gasps of the crowd, the stern voice of the officer reprimanding her. She couldn't escape the images, no matter how hard she tried to push them away. They haunted her like a movie stuck on repeat, each frame amplifying her guilt and regret. News of the incident spread faster than she could have imagined. By the time she was released on bail, a process that involved signing documents and agreeing to appear in court later, videos of her actions had already gone viral online. Social media platforms were ablaze with reactions. Some people mocked her, calling her the entitled tourist or Queen Bootgate. Others expressed outrage, criticizing her lack of respect for tradition and authority. Even her own followers, who usually showered her with praise, turned against her. Comments flooded her posts, many of them harsh and unforgiving. "This is disgusting," one read. "She thinks money makes her better than everyone else." Evelyn scrolled through the notifications on her phone, her hands trembling as she absorbed the backlash. Her once flourishing social media empire was crumbling before her eyes. Sponsors began pulling out of deals. Brands she had partnered with issued statements distancing themselves from her behavior. The glamorous lifestyle she had taken for granted was slipping through her fingers, leaving behind only emptiness and shame. Back at her hotel suite, Evelyn sat alone on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. The luxurious surroundings, the plush carpet, the crystal chandelier, the panoramic view of London, offered no comfort. For the first time in years, she felt truly isolated. Her friends had flown back home earlier than planned, citing family emergencies and prior commitments. Even her assistant stopped answering her calls. Evelyn realized bitterly that when things got tough, there was no one left to stand by her side. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered onto the balcony overlooking the city. The lights of London twinkled below, but they offered none of their usual charm. Instead, they reminded her of how far she had fallen. She thought about the guard again, the way he had stood so still, so dignified, even after she had disrespected him. She wondered what he must have thought of her. Did he see her as just another spoiled tourist, someone who cared only about herself? The thought made her cringe. Determined to salvage what little dignity she had left, Evelyn decided to issue a public apology. She knew it wouldn't undo the damage, but it might. At least, show people that she understood the gravity of her mistake. Early the next morning, she recorded a video message, speaking directly into the camera. Her voice wavered as she admitted her wrongdoing and expressed remorse. "I never intended to hurt anyone or disrespect such an important institution," she said, tears streaming down her face. "What I did was selfish and immature, and I deeply regret my actions. To the Royal Guard, to the people of London, and to everyone who has been offended by my behavior, I am truly sorry." To demonstrate her sincerity, she announced that she would personally cover the cost of cleaning and repairing the damaged uniform. Additionally, she pledged a significant donation to a charity supporting veterans and active service members. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small step toward making amends. When the video went live, the response was mixed. Some critics dismissed her apology as insincere, accusing her of trying to buy forgiveness. Others acknowledged her effort, noting that admitting fault was a difficult thing to do. While the tide of public opinion didn't shift entirely in her favor, Evelyn found solace in knowing she had done the right thing, even if it came too late to undo the harm she had caused. As she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, Evelyn exhaled deeply. The weight of her mistakes still pressed heavily on her shoulders, but for the first time since arriving in London, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this painful experience could teach her something valuable. Something real. Evelyn's apology video sparked a wave of reactions, dividing opinions across social media and news outlets. While some dismissed her words as nothing more than damage control, a desperate attempt to save face, others saw them as genuine. Among those who believed her was a retired journalist named Margaret Hayes, known for her insightful commentary on human behavior. Margaret wrote a thoughtful article titled "Redemption in the Age of Recklessness," which explored how Evelyn's public acknowledgement of her mistake could serve as a turning point if she truly committed to change. The article caught Evelyn's attention late one evening as she scrolled through her phone, still nursing a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Reading Margaret's words felt like a lifeline being thrown to someone drowning in regret. Apologies are easy, Margaret had written, but growth is hard. True redemption comes not from saying sorry, but from doing better. Those sentences struck a chord deep within Evelyn. For days, they replayed in her mind, urging her to take action, not just talk about it. Determined to prove herself, Evelyn began researching ways to contribute meaningfully to causes related to veterans and service members. She reached out to organizations dedicated to supporting military families, volunteering at events, and listening intently to their stories. At first, her presence raised eyebrows. People whispered behind her back, skeptical of her intentions. Was she there because she genuinely cared, or was this another publicity stunt? Evelyn ignored the whispers, focusing instead on learning and helping wherever she could. One day, while assisting at a local veterans center, she met an elderly man named George. He was quiet, with kind eyes that carried the weight of decades of experience. When he learned who Evelyn was, he didn't react with anger or judgment. Instead, he simply asked, "Why are you here?" His question startled her. It wasn't accusatory. It was honest, almost curious. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "I messed up," she admitted softly. "Big time. I want to make things right, or at least try." George nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do after them. If you're serious about changing, stick around. Show up when no one's watching. That's where the real work happens." Those words stayed with Evelyn long after their conversation ended. From that moment on, she resolved to be consistent, not just in her actions, but in her mindset. She stopped obsessing over regaining her old life and focused instead on building a new one. Volunteering became a regular part of her routine. Whether it was organizing care packages, mentoring young veterans transitioning to civilian life, or simply sitting down with someone to hear their story, Evelyn threw herself into the work wholeheartedly. Over time, people began to notice the shift in her. The staff at the Veterans Center grew to trust her, seeing her less as the infamous paint tourist and more as someone willing to roll up her sleeves and help. Even the skeptics softened, recognizing her sincerity. One volunteer, a woman named Clara, pulled Evelyn aside one afternoon and said, "You've changed, haven't you?" Evelyn smiled faintly, nodding. "I'm trying," she replied. "Every day, I'm trying." Her efforts weren't without challenges. There were moments when self-doubt crept in, reminding her of the ridicule she'd faced and the bridges she'd burned. But each time, she pushed through, drawing strength from the connections she was forming. Slowly but surely, Evelyn started to rebuild, not just her reputation, but herself. Months later, Evelyn returned to London, not as a tourist, but as a guest speaker at a charity gala honoring veterans. As she stood backstage, waiting to deliver her speech, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she'd come. The journey had been anything but easy, filled with sleepless nights, harsh lessons, and countless moments of doubt. Yet here she was, standing tall, ready to share her story, not to seek forgiveness, but to inspire others to learn from their own mistakes. When she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Evelyn took a deep breath, looked out at the audience, and began speaking. Her voice was steady, her words heartfelt. For the first time in years, she felt proud, not of wealth or status, but of the person she was becoming. And as the crowd erupted into applause at the end of her speech, Evelyn realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about using it to build a better future. Evelyn's speech at the charity gala marked a turning point, not just for her, but for how others began to see her. Standing on that stage, she spoke candidly about her mistakes, her regrets, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She didn't sugarcoat anything or try to paint herself as a victim. Instead, she owned every part of her story: the reckless act, the backlash, and the difficult journey toward redemption. "I came to London thinking I was untouchable," she admitted, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I thought rules were optional, that respect was something you gave only when it suited you. But what I realized is this. Respect isn't earned by titles, money, or status. It's given freely to those who deserve it. And I didn't deserve it back then. The audience listened intently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to empathy. Evelyn could feel the energy in the room changing, like a heavy cloud lifting. When she finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, genuine, heartfelt, and full of hope. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt seen not for her wealth or fame, but for her humanity. After the event, people approached her to share their thoughts. Some thanked her for being brave enough to admit her faults publicly. Others shared their own stories of mistakes and second chances, creating a sense of connection that Evelyn hadn't experienced in a long time. Among them was a familiar face, a retired royal guard who introduced himself simply as James. He had been stationed outside Buckingham Palace on the day of the infamous paint incident. "You probably don't remember me," James said with a small smile. "But I remember you." Evelyn froze, her heart skipping a beat. She braced herself for anger or resentment. But instead, James extended his hand. "I wanted to say thank you for owning up to what happened and for doing the work to make things right. Not everyone would have done that." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she shook his hand. "Thank you," she replied softly, "for your patience and for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget." The encounter stayed with her long after the gala ended, reinforcing her belief that growth often comes from discomfort. And sometimes, forgiveness can heal wounds we didn't even realize were still open. Back home, Evelyn continued her volunteer work, expanding her efforts to include mentorship programs for young adults struggling to find direction in life. Drawing from her own experiences, she encouraged them to embrace accountability and resilience. "It's okay to mess up," she would tell them during workshops. "What matters is what you do next. You're not defined by your worst moments. You're defined by how you rise above them." Her transformation wasn't lost on the media either. Journalists who had once criticized her now praised her dedication to making amends. Articles highlighted her involvement in charitable causes, and talk shows invited her to discuss her journey. Evelyn accepted these opportunities not to boast, but to spread a message of hope and responsibility. She knew firsthand how easy it was to fall into patterns of selfishness and entitlement, but she also knew that change was possible with effort and humility. As months turned into years, Evelyn found joy in the simple things: meaningful conversations, acts of kindness, and the satisfaction of knowing she was contributing to something greater than herself. Her social media accounts, once filled with flashy photos and extravagant vacations, now showcased her volunteer work and advocacy projects. Followers who had once mocked her now applauded her authenticity, inspired by her willingness to grow. One evening, as she sat on the porch of her modest country home, a far cry from the luxury penthouses she used to inhabit, Evelyn reflected on everything she had been through. The pain, the embarrassment, the sleepless nights, they had all led her here, to a place of peace and purpose. She no longer craved validation from others, because she finally understood her worth wasn't tied to external approval. It came from within, from the choices she made and the person she chose to be. And though the memory of that fateful day in London would always linger, it no longer weighed her down. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. Years passed, and Evelyn's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The woman who once thrived on luxury and attention had become someone deeply rooted in purpose and humility. Her days were no longer filled with designer dresses or extravagant parties, but with meaningful work that brought her a different kind of fulfillment. She spent her mornings mentoring young adults at community centers, her afternoons volunteering at veterans organizations, and her evenings reflecting on how much her perspective had shifted. One crisp autumn morning, Evelyn received an invitation to speak at a national conference about personal growth and accountability. The theme of the event was Lessons from Failure, Turning Mistakes into Milestones. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking still made her nervous, especially when it came to revisiting her past mistakes. But something about the title resonated with her. It reminded her of the journey she'd been on, and the countless people who had supported her along the way. She accepted the invitation, determined to share her story not as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon of hope. The day of the conference arrived, and Evelyn stood backstage, clutching her notes tightly. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, packed with attendees eager to hear insights from speakers who had overcome adversity. As Evelyn stepped onto the stage, the spotlight illuminated her face, and for a brief moment, she felt transported back to that fateful day in London. The gasps of the crowd, the weight of judgment, the crushing realization of her mistake. But this time, the energy was different. The audience wasn't there to ridicule her. They were there to listen, to learn, and perhaps to find inspiration in her transformation. "I'm going to tell you a story," Evelyn began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "It's not a glamorous one. In fact, it's messy, embarrassing, and downright painful at times. But it's my story, and it taught me some of the most important lessons I've ever learned." She recounted the events leading up to the paint incident, sparing no detail. She described the arrogance that blinded her, the chaos she caused, and the overwhelming shame she felt afterward. Then she spoke about the turning points, the moments when she realized she needed to change, the people who believed in her even when she doubted herself, and the hard work it took to rebuild her life. Her honesty struck a chord with the audience, many of whom nodded in understanding or wiped away tears. "When I poured paint on that guard's boots," she said, pausing to let the words sink in, "I thought I was being clever. What I didn't realize was that I was pouring disrespect onto something far greater than myself, an institution built on duty, honor, and sacrifice. That moment changed everything for me. It forced me to confront who I was, and more importantly, who I wanted to be." As she wrapped up her speech, Evelyn emphasized the importance of accountability and second chances. "We all make mistakes," she said, "but what defines us isn't the mistake itself. It's how we respond to it. Growth is uncomfortable. Redemption takes time. And forgiveness, both from others and ourselves, isn't guaranteed. But if you're willing to do the work, real change is possible." When she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering as Evelyn smiled through tears. For the first time in years, she felt truly proud, not of her wealth or fame, but of the resilience and courage it had taken to turn her life around. After the session ended, Evelyn mingled with attendees during a networking break. Many approached her to express gratitude, sharing their own struggles and thanking her for giving them hope. As she chatted with a group of young professionals, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the exit. It was James, the retired royal guard she had met years ago at the charity gala. Their eyes met, and Evelyn excused herself from the conversation to walk over to him. "James," she said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief, "what are you doing here?" He smiled warmly. "I heard you were speaking today. Thought I'd come see how far you've come." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. "You've already seen me at my worst," she joked lightly, though her emotions ran deep. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've done good, Evelyn. Keep going." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before she could say another word. Standing there, Evelyn felt a profound sense of closure. The man whose dignity she had once disrespected had just acknowledged her growth, and in doing so, reaffirmed the progress she had made. It was a quiet moment, yet one of immense significance. As Evelyn left the venue later that evening, she carried with her not just the applause of